Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Written for Our Admonition, Studies in the Old Testament. And we've had a brief break just because of some things that were going on in the past week or so, but we want to pick back up in our discussion about covenants that we had left off on in our previous discussion and finish up what we had started with that because, like we talked about, a covenant is very significant in Scripture. In fact, when we think about Old Testament and New Testament, that word testament is really the word covenant. It has a similar meaning to that. Maybe not in the English language, but most certainly in the languages that were used to write the scriptures, those words have some overlap to them. So we're talking about covenants, and we realize how central that is to the Bible's story. We see covenants beginning all the way back in the book of Genesis, and they continue on in the book of Exodus, and really the foundation of the Old Testament in many respects, at least as far as the nation of Israel is concerned, is the fact that she is under a covenant, or she is part of a covenant, and that defines her existence and defines her relationship to God, which, like we had talked about, if you're in a covenant relationship with God, that means you relate to him in a different way than someone else might, because he has given this to you, he has declared his terms, he's made it clear what it requires of you. And that's really what a covenant is all about. But as part of a covenant, and we alluded to this in our previous conversation, so this is not a surprise, but as part of a covenant, you have both blessings and curses. And again, when we think about who is giving the covenant, that makes sense. And in a sense, God is promising both. He is promising these blessings and these curses, but it's dependent upon how the people part of that covenant react to what God has given to them. So we have here on our slide, just right off the bat, that when God gives a covenant, he sets it forth before people, he's the one that dictates the terms and offers the promises. So like we had talked about with a covenant, it's always God initiating the covenant. That's not to say that every covenant in the Bible is God-given. It's just to say that the covenants we're talking about are always given by God. And he is always the one to dictate the terms. He's always the one to offer the promises. It is never an equal arrangement. There's no negotiation going on. And God is always clear and upfront about what his expectation is and what he will do if his expectations are not met. And that's going to become pretty important when we talk about the curses, so we can wrap our minds around why some of these curses are as harsh as they are. So we need to understand that in the Old Testament law, so we're talking about Genesis or Deuteronomy, that there are two specific sections of Scripture that are going to deal with blessings and curses in the context of a covenant. One of them is going to be in the book of Leviticus, chapter 26, and the other is going to be in Deuteronomy. That's actually going to be a section. So starting in chapter 27 of Deuteronomy all the way through chapter 30, you're dealing with the blessings and curses of the covenant. Just one note to add to that, since we haven't really talked about it that much. The book of Deuteronomy is not per se a second giving of God's law. That's something you'll read about if you read any commentaries about Deuteronomy, but that's not entirely accurate. It's more that God is repeating what he's already told his people and summarizing in many respects for the new generation of Israelites about to go into the land what he expects. So be careful if you come across that. We're not dealing with a second giving of the law. We're dealing with the same things being repeated over and over again and given to a new generation. That aside, that section of Deuteronomy is very extensive and it's very descriptive, I'll say, in terms of both the blessings and the curses, even more so than the book of Leviticus in chapter 26 is. But all of it goes along the track that God is always clear about his expectations. He is not being ambiguous about what he wants. He's not being unclear about what's going to happen. He's not the parent that comes along and says to his child, you better behave or else, and the or else is very ambiguous. That's not the way that God operates. When God sets forth a covenant, he's going to tell you exactly what he will do if you respond to his commands the way he expects, or if you do not respond the way he expects, what he's going to do as a punishment. There's no ambiguity there. There's no lack of clarity. It is plain as day what's going to happen. And God sets this forth to his people and lets them know what they must do, and then things unfold from there. So if we really want to understand what it means to be part of a covenant, and again, we're thinking about this in terms of the old covenant, yes, but this has application to the new, we really need to understand the blessings and curses that go along with these different covenants. So we're going to start on a happy note, talking about blessings. So blessings in God's covenants are always abundant. There's always numerous blessings that are promised. There's always a lot that goes with these covenants as far as the material blessings and the spiritual blessings that God will give to his people. Now, you'll often hear in the Old Testament that the blessings that God promises are exclusively physical, whereas in the New Testament they're exclusively spiritual. That's not really a distinction that the Scripture makes. It's not a distinction the Old Covenant makes, nor that the New Covenant makes. God blesses his people in abundance regardless. And we can try to divide it up into different categories or what have you, but the fact remains, God does bless his people in great abundance. That if you are a part of his covenant and faithful in it, he is going to give you many things that otherwise would not be possible, but as part of that service. Now, it is true that the new covenant does not promise these material blessings like the Old Testament does, so we understand that there is a distinction there. But we also realize that God did bless Israel in a spiritual sense, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. I'm actually going to ask you to join me in Leviticus chapter 26, one of the chapters we mentioned that talks about these blessings and curses. And this is a really good summary, really, of the blessings that God promised to Israel if they were faithful in his covenant. So let's go over to Leviticus chapter 26, and let's go ahead and start in verse 3. So again, we're in Leviticus chapter 26. I'm starting in verse 3. We'll read down to verse 13 together. So starting in verse 3, we read this. If you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments and perform them, then I will give you rain in its season, the land shall yield its produce, and the trees of the field shall yield their fruit. Your threshing shall last till the time of vintage, and the vintage shall last till the time of sowing. You shall eat your bread to the full, and dwell on your land safely. I will give you peace in the land, and you shall lie down, and none will make you afraid. I will rid the land of evil beasts, and the sword will not go through your land. You will chase your enemies, and they shall fall by the sword before you. 5 of you shall chase 100, and 100 of you shall put 10,000 to flight. Your enemies shall fall by the sword before you. For I will look on you favorably, and make you fruitful, and multiply you, and confirm my covenant with you. You shall eat the old harvest, and clear out the old because of the new. I will set my tabernacle among you, and my soul shall not abhor you. I will walk among you and be your God, and you shall be my people. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, that you should not be their slaves. I have broken the bands of your yoke and made you walk upright. So there's a lot that we could talk about in verses 3 through 13, but that's, again, a summary, really, of these blessings that God promises to Israel if they obey him in his covenant. Look back at verse 3. What does it say? If you walk, or when you see that word walk, we're talking about a way of life. If you live in my statutes, in other words, and keep my commandments and perform them, then this is what I will do. So you have that if-then structure presented here, where God is saying that if you will do these things, then this is how I'm going to respond and what I will do. And this is a good thing here, because God is saying that if you'll obey me and do what I've told you to do, look at what I'm going to bestow upon you. Look at all the good things that you're going to receive because of your obedience. Look at the material blessings that are going to be poured forth on you. And again, we could categorize this and break this down, but just collectively, we really see that God is going to bless his people in their land, which again, the land itself was a blessing because remember, Israel was given that land, so they're being blessed by the land itself, and now they're being blessed in the land. And then we also see they're going to defeat their enemies. Again, another significant concern in the ancient world. They were going to put to flight those that would oppose them or those that would try to take them out of their land. God would put those enemies to flight. They would have abundant food. Their harvest and their sowing and their planting, all of that would be successful. Again, if you're in a society that is heavily based upon a harvest and a consistent harvest, that might be something that catches your attention. But then I want you to pay special attention to verses 11 through 12 there. Because again, it goes back to what I just mentioned about the distinction we sometimes make between material and spiritual blessings. We talk about the Old Covenant as though it was only focused on material blessings and material concerns. And again, there is some degree of truth to that. Even Hebrews talks about that in about chapter 9. But I want you to notice the spiritual blessings in verses 11 through 12. Now, there are physical realities that go along with this, yes, so bear with me. But what does God say in verse 11? I will set my tabernacle among you, and my soul shall not abhor you. So God is saying there, and again, the wording of that may not ring right to us, but the wording of it and the way that God expresses this is saying, I'm going to dwell among you. I'm going to be in your midst. I am going to have fellowship with you, and I'm going to favor you. Just think about the perspective in the ancient world they would have had. Again, this goes back to some of the issues they had with their perspectives on idolatry and things like that, where they would see deities in general as very malicious and very hateful and very much always angry. That's not what God is saying here about how he's going to dwell among his people. He's specifically saying, I'm not going to abhor you. That my inner being, this is God saying, my inner being is not going to abhor you. He's going to favor his people. He's going to look at them differently because of his relationship to them. And he says in verse 12, I'm going to walk among them and I'm going to be their God and they are going to be my people. they're going to have fellowship with God in a way that is very much like what Adam and Eve had in the Garden of Eden. Remember that detail in Genesis chapter 3 that God walked with Adam and Eve in the cool of the day? That's kind of what's happening here. Now, this is not happening in a physical sense, so we understand there's a spiritual element to this. But just the knowledge that God was with them, the knowledge that God's presence was known among them, that he would help them through the difficulties that came upon them, that he was blessing them abundantly, that he was there for them. This would have been something that really stood out to these people, especially given where they're at right now during the writing of Leviticus 26, because remember, they're in the wilderness. They are not yet in the promised land. So they're from the perspective of looking on the inside out, as it were. And so they are wanting these blessings to unfold, and God is saying what is going to happen when they reach that point if they're obedient to him. And God is telling them, I'm going to be with you. I'm going to help you. I'm going to sustain you. I'm going to give you everything that you need. And all of this because they're part of his covenant. And all they had to do was uphold their part, which, as verse 3 and 4 mentions there, that they need to walk in God's statutes, keep his commandments, and perform them. If they will do those things, then God will uphold his part. So these blessings are possible. They are feasible. They are something that the Israelites can obtain if they will do what God commands them to do. That's going to be the problem, incidentally, but we're not quite there yet. Another thing I wanted to mention, although we're not going to read this text, but in Deuteronomy chapter 28, in verse 13, I think as a summary statement there in that particular text, you have God saying that he's going to make Israel the head and not the tail through these blessings. And again, it's through their obedience to him in the covenant, but that blessing he's going to give them is for them to be above others. Not that they exalted themselves, but that God has chosen to lift them up and to exalt them on his own terms. Very much like the idea that Jesus expresses in a place like Matthew 23 and verse 12, talking about there, those who exalt themselves shall be humbled, but those who humble themselves shall be exalted, that type of idea, that God will exalt his people, that when they humbly serve him and do what he wants them to do, that he will raise them up and he will empower them to accomplish greater things. So God is more than capable of offering these blessings. He's more than capable of fulfilling these blessings, and this is all happening within his covenant. But I'll emphasize it for a third time. Obedience is critical. And that is still true with the new covenant, by the way. Now, I don't have a passage specifically cited here, but there's so many we could talk about from both Jesus and the apostles in the New Testament that make it plain that this has not changed in a significant way. That God, when he establishes the new covenant and he allows you to become a partaker of that through Christ, he still expects you to be obedient to him. He still expects you to be a worker for him. That has not changed. Now, the wording might have changed. The specific details might be different in terms of what is offered and all of this, but that does not change the fact that overall the structure is still the same. And that's something we need to realize, that the more we understand about how God blessed his people in the old covenant, the more we can realize how he blesses us in the new. It would take us to a place like Ephesians 1, verses 3 through 14, about how blessed the people of Christ are, how God has given to them every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus. That's something for us to think about, because truly, those that are part of Christ's covenant now are blessed immeasurably, much like the Israelites would have been in the Old Covenant and Old Testament had they been obedient to God. So now we move on from blessings to something that's a bit of a darker discussion, darker only because of the troubles that Israel would face, and that's, of course, the curses. So you can't talk about the blessings without talking about the curses, because Leviticus 26 talks about curses in a significant way. Deuteronomy talks about curses in a significant way. There's a lot that goes into this. There's one author that, as I was preparing for this, talked about how there's a 3-to-1 ratio of curses to blessings in the Old Covenant. Think about that for a moment. So there's a lot of blessings, to be sure, and we read about some of them in Leviticus 26, but then think about how there is 3 times as many curses as there are blessings. That's a pretty disturbing ratio when you think about it. But what is the intention behind that, is what I'm trying to go for by mentioning that little note. Why would God want to tell his people how they're going to be cursed if they disobey him? I mean, that seems to be out of character, at least in terms of how people might think about God today. But we need to realize that what God is doing is issuing a warning to Israel, and he's being very explicit about that warning. And it fits within a lot of things that we haven't gotten a chance to talk about yet, but we're going to move into at some point in the future. But in the Old Testament, especially in the law, there is a sense that God has the awareness that Israel is going to go astray from him. Maybe not that generation to whom he speaks, maybe not the generation after that, but there's going to come a day that they go astray. And to have this in writing, that these curses were talked about centuries before they came to pass, is something that could be referred to by the prophets or referred to by any number of people, rulers of various kinds, to point out why it is that these things are taking place. And that's exactly what happens when you get down in the history of the Old Testament toward the prophets. Many of the prophets, their preaching comes from Deuteronomy chapter 27, 28, 29, and 30, because that language is picked up by them in so many places, and they make it clear that this is what God told you and your fathers years ago. I mean, this is not a mystery to you, or at least it's not supposed to be. So again, it's about a warning. It's about making expectations clear. So as horrifying as these curses are to us when we read through them, and I have to tell you, they truly are horrifying. You're talking about things like barrenness, drought, and sickness in the land. You're talking about Israel being overtaken by her enemies, being besieged in her cities to the extent that they begin cannibalism and eating their own children. I mean, it's horrifying to even envision that, let alone understand the reality that that really took place. But these are the curses that God said would happen. He warned them before it ever came to pass. And that's not saying that God wanted it to happen. That's not saying that God made it happen. It's saying that God was clear on the front end that if they do certain things or don't do certain things, this is going to be the consequence and the outcome. Again, God is not that ambiguous parent that's saying, obey me or else. He's saying, if you obey me, this is what's going to happen. And if you disobey me, this is what's going to happen. No vagueness, no lack of clarity. It is simply something that is set forth before Israel for that purpose. So these curses are horrible. No doubt about that. They never should have happened. God did not want them to happen, but he had to be clear with them that they might happen if they do these things or don't do these things that I've been saying. But I think the worst curse of all, out of all that Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 15 through 68 talks about, has to be the fact that God would no longer dwell among his people, that he would no longer make his presence known. That has got to be the worst curse of them all, out of all the ones that are listed. You might scratch your head and wonder about that and think, how is that possible? But the fact that God withdraws his fellowship from someone is dark indeed, because it's that reality that he no longer favors them, that relationship has been severed, that sin has now separated God from his people once again, and they are now in a very precarious position. They no longer have that hedge about them. They are now in a very dangerous situation, more so than they ever had been before. So the fact that God would not dwell among his people, the fact that he would hand them back over to the people that had held them captive for so long, it's not going well for Israel when they end up in this position. These curses, again, are horrible. They should not happen. They should never have happened. But unfortunately, in many cases, they did. But we must also add this detail, and this is again where it's important to read Deuteronomy chapters 27 through 30 as a unit and not just divide them up, but to read them all together to have a full picture. Despite the curses that would come upon Israel for her disobedience, and that did come upon her because of her disobedience, God promised that Israel could return, that he was not through with them. Again, this is something that's a bit unexpected maybe, because you would think that when these curses unfold, that's basically God saying, I'm done with you. He's washing his hands of the situation and moving on to something else. But that's not really what's happening here. Because the intention behind these different plagues and these curses that God says are going to happen, it's meant to be corrective. We briefly talked about this a little bit when we talked about God and his attributes and his different ways of acting toward man. But whenever God issues discipline, he's not doing that because he derives pleasure from it. He's not doing it because it gives him some sick sense of satisfaction. He's not doing it just because he doesn't know what else to do. He's doing it because it has a corrective effect. And that's what these curses are meant to accomplish. Because we're going to see in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 1 through 3 in just a moment, that God is saying in very clear terms that Israel can come back, that when they finally come to their senses and realize that what they have done was wrong, there is a pathway for them to return. Let's read Deuteronomy chapter 30 now, verses 1 through 3, and let's understand that God does provide a pathway back even despite these curses. Now it shall come to pass, when all these things come upon you, referring again to those curses, the blessing and the curse which I have set before you, and you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God drives you, and you return to the Lord your God and obey his voice, according to all that I command you today, you and your children, with all your heart and with all your soul, that the Lord your God will bring you back from captivity and have compassion on you, and gather you again from all the nations where the Lord your God has scattered you. Wow. So despite these curses, God is saying that when you come to your senses, when these curses accomplish their correction that he intended, then he will bless you once again. That you'll turn back to him and he will once again be there to support you and return to your side and help you to overcome once you come to your senses. I will tell you that in some respects, what we're talking about really centers in on something like the parable of the prodigal son, or the parable of the wasteful son would be a maybe more modern way to put that. We know that story quite well. You have the prodigal or the wasteful son that wants his father's inheritance. He takes it and spends it on wasteful things, things that have no lasting value. He ends up being broke and penniless. He's out there in the pigsty, wallowing in filth, barely able to scrape by a living. He's in bad shape. But something happens as he recalls the father's blessings to him previously and how well he had it. And he comes to his senses and returns. And remember, the father in that parable, again, the father there being God, welcomes that lost child back with open arms. That's basically what you're seeing here when we talk about these blessings and these curses. Because God, although he said very clearly from the start, here's what I'm going to do if you obey me, here's what I'm going to do if you disobey me, these blessings and these curses, he also understood that his people would have that opportunity to return to him, that the door was not permanently shut, that they could indeed once again do his will, and that he was going to give them that opportunity. And he did that many times with those people. It was not just a one-time affair. We talked about the book of Judges earlier this year. We see that happening several times among the people of God where they go astray and come back and go astray and come back. It's a cycle with them. And yet we still see the fulfillment many times of verses 1 through 3. Does that not show us the graciousness of God? Does that not show us his love and his willingness to bear with us and show us patience? That he's willing to give us those chances and opportunities to return to him. Now, we would do well not to squander them. We would do very well to make sure we make use of those opportunities, to understand that we don't want to be under these curses. We don't want to put ourselves in a situation where we are cursed, but rather be in a position where we can be blessed. And the only way to do that is through obedience. The only way to do that is through faithfulness to God and trust in him and his ways. And that no matter what we do, we center our lives on him, and now, in our time, on his son Jesus, the only one who's able to give us what we truly need. So I hope that through this conversation, it's been enlightening to you about these curses and these blessings and their purposes, and understanding that there's a balance to this in Scripture, but also that these things all have a reason for existing, and that these things are fundamental to what it means to be in a covenant relationship with God, not only in the Old Covenant time, but even now in the New Covenant that Christ has established. That's all we have to say for right now. We're going to resume our conversation next week on a slightly different subtopic, but still referring to the Old Testament. And as always, I thank you for your time and attention to this, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.